Hello, and welcome to the inaugural installation of AWA's Wild Thoughts podcast. My name is Bill Ingersoll, and I am joined today by Pete Nelson, Kayla White, and Craig McGowan, all founding members of AWA. For the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be discussing one of the most important attributes of wilderness, remoteness, that sometimes elusive element that hikers and paddlers often crave, but which seems constantly imperiled by the creeping sprawl of modern civilization. Does remoteness still exist? Can it be saved? And just as importantly, can we measure it? Pete has offered to lead our discussion, so let's get started.
Great, thank you, Bill. Very simple structure here. I'll frame the issue with a couple of slides here, and then I'm going to ask, what do we mean by remoteness? I'll start off by asking one of our esteemed colleagues. We'll go from there with a free-flowing discussion, very informal. So I want to start with this. I decided if we're going to talk about remoteness, I should go to a place that's remote. This was originally a video. It doesn't work as well as I'd like, so I'll just show you a picture. This is from about a week ago, and I went to one of the most remote, wild, and beautiful places in the entire Adirondack Park. This is off trail somewhere in the Siamese Ponds Wilderness, which, as my colleague Bill Ingersoll, who just gave the thumbs up, said, is the quintessential Adirondack Wilderness. It is as lonely and remote and wonderful as you get. Indeed, to get to this spot that you're looking at, I was on trail for, I don't know, about 2 miles with perfect snow conditions, and I saw no one at all. By many standards, this would be remote. I picked deliberately a spot that was 1 mile, at least 1 mile from the nearest road, paved or unpaved road. And if I were to get in trouble here, or decide to just sit down for a while, I wouldn't see anybody for hours, days, probably weeks. It's off the beaten path. It's a wonderful spot, but I'm not entirely alone here. It's pretty quiet. The day that I went and took this video and this picture, there wasn't a lot of noise, but there was some. I could hear machinery. I could hear banging here and there. Because also about a mile away from this picture is one of the world's largest garnet mines, the Barton mining operation. And the noise from the Barton mines bleeds into the Siamese Ponds Wilderness, sometimes a surprising distance, as my friend Bill can testify. Certainly in this spot, I could hear it. Now, this is not a screed against the Barton mines. They've been mining for generations. They are, by all accounts, good stewards of their operation. It is only to pose this question. As remote as this feels to me, if I can hear a mining operation, is it truly remote? And if I ask that question about myself, I can ask that question about nature, about the ecology of this spot, the flora and fauna and how they're impacted. If mining noise bleeds in at the level of conversation, which is what Barton has measured it to be, is that truly remote? So we'll explore that question. For those of you that know the Siamese Ponds Wilderness briefly, that's about where I was. I don't use GPS, but I came in on the trail to Peaked Mountain Pond and then went north to a spot that was about a mile from anything. And it's definitely off the beaten path. The next picture is near and dear to my heart. This is a picture from an inn holding that my wife and I stumbled into, literally, owning in the middle of the high peaks. Those of you that know your trees can recognize that this is virgin forest. That spruce that you see is more than 100 feet tall, 2 foot at the diameter, at breast height, 2 foot diameter, 350 to 400 years old. It's an amazing spot. It was never logged. It was never burned. It is about 3 miles from the trailhead. It's a bushwhack. There's no trail to it. It's we've never seen anyone there except ourselves and those that we invite. Yet, this very view you're looking at night has lights in the distance. You are looking at the Keene Valley. You can see a little bit of the outline of Hurricane Mountain. If I can see lights from this, if I can see civilization, am I truly remote? Also, while this is further from any road than the Siamese Ponds location that I went to, it's still less than 3 miles from the road. I want to show you a quick picture here. This is a map that was originally developed by the Adirondack Park Agency, and then AWA did our own version of it, an improved version. The spots in red are the very few spots that are more than 3 miles from a road that has motorized activity. It's about 3% of the park. It's not much. If you add disturbance zones, the effects that roads have, we're down around 1%. The picture that you just saw, wonderful tract that we own, is not 3 miles from a road. Route 73 in Cascade Pass is about 2.5 miles away. So it doesn't qualify for this standard of remoteness. 3 miles is arbitrary, but it's been used and talked about for years, in fact, for decades. Not only that, the trail to the over the Brothers to Big Slide is only a half mile away. And that's a trail that in places is 8 to 10 feet wide. It can have dozens of people on it. We know from learning more about disturbance zones that raptors, for example, will avoid human activity, even on a foot trail, up to 500 meters. This picture is within 500 meters of that trail. That means that this virgin forest is impacted because raptors are not going to be comfortable here. Can we truly call that remote? Whether we can or not, it's obviously a scarce resource. AWA is committed to protecting it, but we need to understand it and think about what we really mean by remoteness and how valuable it is. So let me go ahead and start by asking what we mean by remoteness. I'm going to take the slide presentation off and ask, as a start, our esteemed board chair, Kayla White, who certainly knows an awful lot about remoteness. Kayla, what does remoteness mean to you?
Sure. So remoteness to me, I feel like um is distance, right? When we're thinking about the definition of remoteness, it has to do with distance and usually from civilization. But I think that when we're talking about distance, we're talking about two ways, like two kinds of measurements of distance. One is the actual, measurement of distance. It's from point A to point B. How far away are you from a road or a trail or some man-made structure? But then it's also that perceived distance, right? Where you can maybe go a little bit and bushwhack a little bit into the woods, and you can really feel like you're remote, you can feel like you're a distance away. But in actuality, maybe you're not too far away from a trail or some sort of man-made structure. So it's interesting, remoteness, because it can be quantitative and it can be qualitative, right? There's different ways that we can measure remoteness. And I think when we're thinking about remoteness, both things are really important. And I think you can't think about wilderness character without thinking about remoteness. And there have definitely been experiences that I've had where, I've been off bushwhacking, and because I was, in the high peaks, and even though I was like, crawling through super thick crumholts, and quite a distance away from a trail, because of just the location, because of the echo, and the geography, I was able to hear people who were, quite a distance away from me, but on trail, and making quite a bit of noise. And you've been out, and I'm sure we've all have seen planes, seen helicopters, heard them, and that's also impacts our feelings of remoteness. But really, when we're talking about remoteness, or really when we're talking about wilderness, we can't not talk about remoteness and really that spirit of wildness. And I guess I'll open it up.
Sure. Well, let me just follow up very briefly with you on that, because we AWA is urging the APA to develop a policy on remoteness. Actually, let me follow up with Bill. Bill, you're an expert on the Adirondack Park and on remoteness and all of that. Is remoteness and solitude the same thing? The State Land Master Plan uses both terms. it uses remoteness specifically as a criterion by which we judge whether an area should be a wilderness area, but it uses solitude and remoteness both as subjective measures. What I heard Kayla say definitely was about solitude as well. Are those the same, and how do we sort that out?
It's nice when they are the same, but not necessarily. You're right; they're both mentioned in the state land master plan, but they're sort of soft criteria. Um, there's not really any currently any measurable bar that says a wilderness area must be this remote, and solitude is what it says is solitary experiences are maybe possible. So you're not even a guarantee that you're going to enter a wilderness area and be the only person there. Not everybody even wants that experience. I'm pretty sure there some people who are actually attracted to the crowded trails, but for me, I've always sought out those lonely places, that are way back out there. And sometimes if you pick right, the right place, you don't necessarily need to be in the deepest possible spot in the wilderness area to be alone. But when you are alone, when you do have that solitary experience, it's the coolest thing in the world to think that in a planet with 7 billion other human beings on it, that you are the only person who ever chose to go be at that spot at that moment. And I've had plenty
Yeah.
of those experiences. And that's what makes an actual wilderness designation unique. Parks of all kinds and all sizes and all locations are important, whether it be an urban park or a county park along a canal towpath or a nature reserve on reclaimed farmland. Those are all important places, but wilderness can only be in these big remote places. And the opportunity to be alone, the opportunity to find those remote locations are what makes this land classification impossible to have, say, in a suburban environment. It has to be in these big, wide open places. Otherwise, it's just a patch of trees, just like any other park.
Sure. Craig McGowan, can we measure this in some way? Is there a way that we can approach remoteness and measure it if for no other purpose than to be able to protect it better and to say this is a scarce resource?
Well, I know personally speaking, for me, the measurement starts with the ordeal. If you go through quite an ordeal to get someplace, it feels remote. Unfortunately, sometimes we go a considerable distance and then we can find that the place doesn't feel remote. I can recall a few years ago climbing to the top of New York's highest peak, Mount Marcy. And it's a good hike. It's 7 miles to get to the top. But when I got there and as I crested over the summit and looked out, there were 100 people up there who had gotten there before me and were eating their lunch. And I was having difficulty finding a place to sit and enjoy the view. So I think there's more to it than just distance. And I think, as you mentioned, there's sounds, there's smells. I've skied a great distance into the backcountry and crossed over a snowmobile trail. No sounds of snowmobiles, but still have smelled that 2-cycle engine oil in the air. So in preparation for this, I tried to think about how would you define remoteness? And I think really it starts with distance and the ordeal it takes, but it's far more than that.
Indeed. The state land master plan talks about remoteness. As Bill said, it doesn't put any particular measurement on it. It's not possible, but it seems as though the wise folks who crafted the slump in 1972 tried to get at least some handle on it by using road mileage. And that's a current debate at the APA because there's been a proposal to consider what road mileage really is in wild forests and what we mean by no material increase. Is road mileage any kind of good measure for remoteness? What do we think about that?
It's a good start. It is something that we want to, a metric that we want to keep track of. but if all those roads were clustered together in one little corner of the park, there could be 1,000 miles of roads, but then a million acres of nothing. And so, what's the big deal? Um, yeah, I do think that when those road miles do start veering off into one of those blank spots in the map, that's when you have the road mileage eroding the potential for remoteness and solitude. And that's where it becomes an issue.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
agree. I agree. I think it depends where the road goes. If the road goes deep into a wilderness area and essentially allows you to penetrate deep into that, that's very different than a road that skirts the edges of a wilderness area.
One
And
of the
I think
things
it's a
that,
good,
go ahead, please.
oh, I was just gonna say, and I think it's a good thing to think about, hiking trails as well, right? Hiking trails and snowmobile trails and different things like that. Obviously not in wilderness areas, but wild forest areas. Thinking about those things going into the heart of wilderness areas definitely impacts like wildlife, like you said before, Pete.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we're talking about in draft mode, we haven't figured it out as an organization yet or formalized it. But in talking to the Adirondack Park Agency, one of the things that we're talking to them about is trying to expand the idea of how we think about roads and remoteness along exactly the lines that you've been talking about. Two things in particular. One is to consider not just the road, but where it goes in calculating road density, which has become a measure that's used elsewhere. It's used in national forest areas and national parks. It's been used in a variety of academic studies. Road density gets at that idea that it's not how long the road is, but where it goes. And then the other one is disturbance zones. That is, if we consider a road, it's not just the road itself, but it's the impact that it has based on what kind of traffic is on it, what kind of what kind of use it gets, the frequency of use, and what kind of wildlife we're talking about. And road densities, as I mentioned in my little slide, can be pretty big. Raptors are among the bigger ones, but 500 meters either side of a road is a huge amount of impact. So should the Adirondack Park Agency develop a policy that considers those things? What do you think?
Absolutely. It should be one of the, I mentioned before that it was a soft metric. It was one of those subjective things that remoteness when you see it, and that's about as much as state land master plan has to say about it. But increasing opportunities for remoteness is something that could be measured. Going back to that map that you showed, there are ways, so if you determine what your criteria are going to be, X number of miles from the nearest road or from the nearest motorized lake, and map where those areas are. What we saw with Boreas Ponds edition a few years ago with the high peaks, that here is this massive acreage being padded on to the High Peaks Wilderness area, and yes, that's a great thing. But at the same time, we're opening to the public this road that's been closed to the general public for over a century, and that this new public road leading to the Boreas Pond is actually eroding the existing remoteness of places like Allen Mountain. And that those because it is now possible with the reopening of Gulf Brook Road that the public can drive closer to the summit of Allen Mountain than they ever could before the state acquisition. So that's an example of adding acreage to a wilderness area is well and good, but when you're opening those roads into the deep remote places, you're actually reducing the amount of remoteness, which has impacts on both human enjoyment as well as wildlife behavior.
And we can't make more of it, right? You can't make more remoteness. What I've seen over the 50 years or so I've been going up to the Adirondacks is that it's less remote now than it used to be, and it continues to be developed, and preserving that remoteness is hard to do. It's, as Bill mentioned, when the state acquires new lands. In some cases, we see remoteness decline. So I believe that we need to manage this. We need to look at it closely and figure out ways to measure it, manage it, and preserve it.
Yeah, it's tough, because it's like once that road is created, usually nobody wants to close it, right? They want to have that access and they want to keep it as is, but we all know that once you close a road, like the trees will grow back. Like, you can rewild these areas. So I think that that at least gives me hope, and should give people hope. But it's just like really that willpower to be able to look at something and say this can be something else, and it can, and going back to what it was previously is not us taking a step back. I think if anything, that is kind of acknowledging our limits as people, and that we don't just need civilization, we need wildness too.
You're making me think about flowed lands, which I love that view. Everybody knows that view, of course, and it's a wonderful view and it feels wild. But if we saw it in 1925, we would have a very different point of view. There were roads all over the place. There were routes going up Mount Colden. I mean, you're right. That's a beautiful thing that we can reclaim them. Kayla, I wonder about this. I think about it a lot. We haven't necessarily talked about it that much as a advocacy organization, but should we pay as much attention to trails, to foot trails, as we do to roads? They're very different, of course, so it's a different issue, but yet foot trails have an impact. Should we be considering the extent of foot trails or how they have an impact? What do you think about that? I mean, you are intimately involved in trails that go up to high peaks, and there's been the suggestion that we should make all of the trails on high peaks official, even the ones that have been traditionally herd paths long ago, not anymore. Should we be considering trails when we talk about remoteness, and maybe think about whether a particular trail should be moved, changed, closed, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to factor that in because it impacts, right? It impacts wildlife. It becomes this scar on the landscape. It absolutely affects the ecology. So I think, yeah, we definitely have to think about it. And and thinking about when Boreas was then added, then people were like, oh, well, now we need a trail going from there up to Allen, or we need a trail, there was a herd path from Gray to Marcy, and for a long time people wanted that to be a trail, and the DEC kind of officially closed it as a herd path because it was damaging alpine vegetation. And I feel like there are lots of instances where people want to have shortcuts, right? They want to kind of sometimes go from peak to peak, from point A to point B, but that's not always what's best for the ecology of the area, especially when thinking of the alpine summits. And why do we need multiple trails going up the same mountain? Why do we need all of the trails going up Mount Marcy, right? There's lots of trails going up Mount Marcy if you think about it.
There are a lot of trails.
Yeah. And it's, why do we need all of these trails? Do we need all these trails? Like, I don't think we do. And, you hear people talk and they're like, well, why can't there be a trail from here to there and here to there? And I think it's like you get into this like slippery slope, right? Where we're just cutting trails to cut trails and really not considering what it's doing to wildlife, to the flora and fauna. I think those are absolutely things we need to factor in.
Kayla, what do you think in terms of increased volume? of trail usage? Does creating more trails spread out people and make the load on existing trails less? Isn't there a balancing act there, or is that a myth?
No, there's absolutely a balancing act there too. So there's a lot of things going on. It's, how many people can park at the places, whether there's shuttles, like, so there's the how many people can access a certain place. And then there's also thinking about the tread, making sure that the width of the trail can withstand the usage. I saw a lot of damage along Franconia Ridge in the White Mountains. I went over there to talk with their stewards and kind of look at the damage in that alpine area. And a lot of it, they see so many more people, so many more, so much higher usage than we see on our mountains, even on our busiest mountains. And really what they find is that they've started building in pull-offs so people can kind of pass each other, and really where they see the most damage are the places where people are trying to pass one another, because there's so many people on that ridge. So yeah, I mean, you definitely have to build trails to withstand the use, to keep them wide enough to be able to allow enough people to kind of hike it and pass each other, and but also, if you're thinking about, should we concentrate use or should we spread it out, that's a huge topic too. DEC's policy is to disperse use, but thinking about the animals, thinking about how that impacts animals, does it make sense then? And, maybe it doesn't. So I think those are all important factors.
Bill Ingersoll, should we concentrate use or spread it out?
There in my view, there is no one solution. There are some places where you just have so many people that if you were to spread it out, then you're just facing a situation where eventually you're just going to have like a human being standing on every available spot of ground, which I don't think is what we want either. But there are also places that that really don't. I mean, we talk about the high peaks, and the very high number of people who go there on any given weekend. But there are plenty of other places in the Adirondacks and elsewhere that don't get anywhere near that use, and having a few additional trails here and there open up recreational possibilities isn't going to be that huge of an issue. So I think it's if you're trying to, in my personal view, if you're trying to deal with a user management, when you have a large number of people and you're worried about the impacts they're going to have, then it might be a better idea to actually try and keep them, on concentrate more than to disperse. In that way, because you're in between. Yes, you may have like these high volume trails, but in between those trails are going to be pockets of quietness. That might achieve your wilderness management goals. Even though people aren't going there and seeing them, they exist. I was told years ago by a DEC manager, who were talking about the high peak, and he says, yes, there may be like 1,000 people on the Marcy Dam Trail at any given time, but you could theoretically, you can step 500 feet off that trail perpendicularly in any direction, and you might be someplace where no one has stood for 50 years.
Right.
So a lot of it is a matter of perception.
It is. I agree with that. And I'm glad you brought up the idea of measuring, because as we all know, so much of the debate about this stuff is rhetoric. And it'd be nice to have actual evidence and experience and things that we understand better instead of just the rhetoric. Which reminds me, since I've become more involved in Adirondack activism, this question of remoteness, the question of roads, how those things intersect, mostly locates around snowmobile trails in wild forest, and the proposal to have community connectors, which the DEC promised to local towns to allow snowmobile routes to get folks from one town to another. Craig, is there a way that we can accommodate community connectors and avoid the trouble that that we see with the compromise of remoteness? Is there any way to get through that issue, or has it been doomed by rhetoric?
Well, Pete, as you know very well, the New York State Constitution weighs in on tree cutting, and there's been a long history of court decisions on tree cutting. And so to build community connectors, at least in the current environment, there's that whole issue of how many trees do you need to cut. Personally, I feel that it's possible to build some of these trails if we can do it in a way that touches on what we talked about earlier, which is not penetrating deeply into wild areas and disturbing those. It's a complicated thing, and I think it's still going to play out over the next couple of years as we figure out what all these court rulings really mean to us.
Yeah, and I'll make an editorial comment on that. I, on behalf of AWA, was invited to be part of the trail stewardship group that DEC organized, potentially or ostensibly, I should say, to address that very issue. And I'm going to have to say they haven't. They've avoided the hard stuff, and we really still don't have a good handle on how we decide whether a certain trail in a certain wild forest area is constitutional, if it meets muster, if it cuts too many trees, if it's appropriate or not. So I would urge everybody watching this podcast to be diligent about that. We have to be very careful that we encourage the state to ask the really tough questions, because even in a group that they formed to ask those tough questions, we haven't resolved anything yet, and it's been months and months and months. Bill Ingersoll, we're coming to the end of our time here. Any concluding thoughts or ideas that you have about remoteness you'd like to leave us with?
Only that, for me, that sense of remoteness is one of the, the key things about a wilderness experience. And when you go out there, like I say, you don't always have to be in the deepest possible spot in the woods. You do have to be a little, clever, maybe a little bit lucky, curious. You will find those spots. They're out there. If you really want the solitude, remote experience, explore.
Great. Any other closing thoughts from anyone else?
I do think that there is something visceral about being in a remote area, and some kind of a feeling that's not possible to get in any other part of life. Being in a place where you put a little bit of time to get there, a little bit of work. There's a view over the Cold River Valley that I've seen many times, where you look out and it just sends a shiver down your spine when you look out and say, there's nothing out there. It's incredible. And I hope we can do more to keep that kind of experience available to people as time goes on. It's not going to be easy, but it's worth it.
All right. Well, Bill, I'll hand it to you to wrap things up.
Well, thank you for joining us, folks. This video podcast is a new undertaking for us, but with your support, we hope to grow our Wild Thoughts series into an entertaining and an informative resource for all things Adirondack wilderness. Please share your thoughts and feedback, and remember that we are a small grassroots organization with a small budget and big ambitions. If you like what you've seen, please visit us at AdirondackWilderness.org and click that donate button. That's all for tonight. So on behalf of all of us at AWA, goodbye for now, and we'll see you on the trail.
Right.